The Magico M7 is an extraordinary speaker, as it should be at its price point. Except, price isn't always a good indicator of sonic quality to the degree that you might expect. And even allowing for price and appropriate budget, the M7 will mainly appeal to knowledgeable music lovers. The Magico M7 is a large floor-standing speaker that's near the top of Magico's premier M speaker series and is part of a new generation of M speakers that began with the new M9 flagship a few years ago. The M7 measures 65 inches tall, 29 inches deep, and 19 inches wide. Each speaker weighs 526 pounds. Price is $375,000 per pair. The M7 has a variety of special features. Of course, this is a cones-in-a-box design, so it may seem conventional in that it doesn't use some new principle like force field warping to make sounds that you can hear. I visited Magico headquarters in Northern California to talk to Alon Wolf, the CEO, about what makes the speaker special and to do some extended listening. Wolf emphasized that the decision to use cones in a box is predicated on two broad factors. One is that every alternative operating architecture like planar magnetic, horn, electrostatic, Walsh, plasma, etc. has some major sonic problem that is extremely hard to overcome. Each alternative tends to have strengths as well, but if you're trying to design speakers that deliver a believable rendition of what we call the absolute sound, you can't have such a hole in the bucket. The hole in the bucket is not a thing that can simply be addressed with careful engineering. These are problems more akin to problems of physics. The bass cancellation roll-off of planars, the giant woofer requirements of horn and bass, and so on. Now, never say never, an innovation might arise that addresses these issues. But right now, his experience is that dynamic driver speakers are the best bet to deliver excellent performance across the board. We will come back to the significance of across-the-board performance. In addition, there's a huge amount of knowledge about how to make all the complex parameters of a speaker work when using dynamic drivers in a cabinet. These parameters include smooth power response, linear and nonlinear distortion, compression, crossover parameters, cabinet vibration, dynamic range, sensitivity, phase response, and more. Building on this significant knowledge base allows performance to be advanced from a higher starting point. As one indication of this process, the M7 drivers are the 8th generation of Magico driver technology. The M7 is chock full of special engineering, but nothing unheard of or certainly not mysterious. This is a 4-way system. That might seem like a so what, but it turns out to have a significant role in the M7's sonic profile. That's because even with advanced drivers, which the M7 also has, sending low and mid bass to dual 12-inch woofers and upper bass and lower mid-range to dual 9-inch mid-woofers allows each of these woofer types to be optimized for their respective bass ranges while not forcing the 5-inch mid-range to go lower than it can do with nearly ideal behavior. It also allows the upper bass drivers to be mounted far from the floor, reducing the floor bounce cancellation unevenness of many speakers. Component quality in the M7 is very high. Some individual crossover parts cost Magico thousands of dollars each. When I arrived, Wolf had just come from a comparative capacitor testing session, so this isn't just a matter of shopping for the good stuff. R&D money is needed to know what is actually good. Terminals are made of solid silver. Wiring is done with minimal junctions and solid core wiring. Feet are a custom copper aluminum constrained layer design with optimized damping. The cabinets are carbon fiber monocoque with extensive bracing and damping based on laser interferometry testing. The carbon monocoque is sandwiched between two massive aluminum panels, which are CNC machined from 800-pound aluminum billets and then through-bolted together with tension rods. An aluminum cap and base are also CNC machined for strength and acoustic shape. The entire speaker is then subject to a complete Klippel testing program to measure a plethora of parameters. Unsatisfactory results generate design modifications, and then testing is repeated until benchmark parameters are exceeded. Wolf emphasized that the parameters that Magico used are not necessarily standard parameters. But As we say, I can't, and most of you can't, reason from technical parameters to sonic quality. So we listen and report our objective observations with the absolute sound as a reference. All right, let's talk about sound quality, or making this price point seem rational or quasi-rational. The Magico M7 delivers the highest sound quality by our metrics that I've heard among loudspeakers. I haven't heard them all by any means, so I don't consider that a terribly meaningful statement in terms of some objective ranking. And while I think our methodology of assessing equipment has nearly universal goals, your perception could be slightly different than mine. But your perception probably isn't very different, and my summary may give you some idea of how this all adds up for experienced listeners and why this review might be interesting. From here on, I mainly summarize my observations and provide some context for them, but I leave it to you to decide whether these observations seem to describe attractive sonic performance. Well, I've heard many speakers in this price range. To add some depth to my observations, the other standout speakers I've heard at this level include the Title for Bugatti system and the MBL 101X. I'll return to those later because I think these three speakers each have distinctive qualities that fit with different listening sensitivities. Understanding that distinction is important for prospective buyers. First, though, let me enumerate some of what the M7 does that's so special. We've recently been using the word vivid to describe an overall impression of some of the best equipment that we are hearing. The M7 is vivid in the way we've intended. Vividness should not be thought of as an effect, but rather as the sense of a comprehensive lack of distortion. Low compression, rich texture and detail, coherence across the spectrum, and across the image. Vividness is not based on coloration in an effort to get around the limitations of recordings or rooms or technology. Vividness ideally results from the lack of noise, compression, comb filtering, frequency dips, and resonant blur. Since we're so accustomed to these artifacts, components that reduce them, like the M7, could be described with a list of not this and not that commentary, except that the diminution of these artifacts leaves you with a vivid sense of the music, because real music in real space is vivid. The audiophile brain, of course, wants more detail, and I'm happy to oblige. The first specific and special thing about the M7 is sound staging that simply seems to hang in space rather than clearly emanating from the speakers. Combine this with a soundstage window that seems realistically large rather than slightly or significantly miniaturized, and we're really getting somewhere. But that's not all. The stage depth with the M7 is deeper in a way that approximates real sound in a real performance hall at times. Then you add more stable performer placement. MBLs, at least the 101E and 101X, are the only other speakers I've heard that so consistently, more consistently I think, sound like the performers are in a venue in front of you rather than sounding like a good virtual reality effort. The M7 does a more believable simulation of the stage because it's rather clear about performer locations. Some recordings, unfortunately, don't support this due to odd microphone mixing decisions. Don't get me started. But when they do, the results are unusually believable. Also, I would note that some, maybe even many recordings yield more precise image placement than live music. My experience with the M7 is that such imaging doesn't make your brain think the sound is artificial, because experience in many environments gives similar precision. An example would be people talking around a table. You know where they are. If you know live music, you'll know that many seats in many venues aren't this precise, but I believe this is a recording issue, closed mic recordings versus far field concert listening. And it's mostly an issue that floats up in your head once the music from the M7 stops, but it isn't a distraction while listening. The M7 imaging is a great pleasure and helps compensate for the lack of visual data. Our next special sonic element with the M7 is that you get a sense of superb instrumental definition. This is done at the same time that the M7 seems smoother and lower distortion than most other speakers. The Title for Bugatti system has this sense of unperturbed, unflappable performance too. The M7s allow you to hear each instrument clearly, yes, but they also deliver a tonal density that gives you the sense that a filter you never noticed, at least without reference to real music, has now been removed. The believable richness of each instrument combined with high definition and low etch is magnificent. The kicker, I think, is that the M7 brings these qualities into the bass. For bass lovers, this is, of course, a good thing if you like to follow bass lines and artistry. Importantly for everyone, this bass performance means that the definition and information density quality is coherent across the spectrum with the M7. This removes a sense of artifice and gets the listener one step closer to believability. When different frequency bands have different character, it is a tell. The M7 gets away from this problem and so sounds more like real instruments in a venue. The third standout element is that the voicing of the M7 is pretty resolutely flat in terms of frequency response. There just aren't obvious bands of emphasis when judged against the approximately -1 dB per octave psychoacoustically preferred tilt in room from 40 Hz to upper treble. This means that well-balanced recordings sound impressively right. It also means that bright recordings sound bright. But note that challenging recordings that on lesser speakers trigger distortions may, on the M7, be revealed as nicely balanced. I found that the frequency balance of the speaker was less at the forefront of my mind on many tracks because the lack of characteristic coloration generated the sense that the balance on offer was simply the balance of the recording. This is true up to a point because wrong recording EQ is just obviously wrong. But the overall takeaway is that with real music, you don't think about frequency response. It's often similar with the M7 voicing. Now, of course, if you need frequency colorations to reassure you that your expensive speakers are doing something, the M7 will not be for you. Next, I noticed that the M7 is also wonderfully broadband. Low bass is solid to below 30 Hz and probably lower. I just didn't have the musical material to check. And focus on this very low frequency band seems a bit like concern about a party trick, but maybe my wide musical tastes aren't wide enough to comprehend its significance. In any event, we played multiple tracks where the bass was both detailed and seemed to rise up from the depths of the Earth's core. Nice. At the other end of the spectrum, cymbals and upper piano overtones were delivered beautifully. The detail of the upper registers, combined with total density and lack of grain and harshness, is what music lovers want but don't always get. We can think of broadband in another sense, which we normally call dynamic range. The beauty of the M7 is that it seems uncompressed while not getting shouty or piercing. It's unforced, like real music that is unforced, although some concerts are just ridiculously overamplified. Now, while the M7 has a sensitivity of 92 dB and has excellent dynamics, it might take bigger amplifiers than we had for this session to get to the level of the best horns. In any case, in practical terms, it also may be that the M7 can't quite do dynamically what near-field listening to percussion can do. To address this, you might need special horn speakers, and you'd have to use big amps in a big room, as Jacob Heilbrunn did in his review of the Avant-Garde Trios. And, as Jacob reported, then there are other trade-offs. All right, now, for the impossible question, value. Besides the logical confusion between, can I afford this, and is this worth the money to someone who can afford it, which are very different questions, anyone who can afford the Magico M7 might reasonably want to know if they deliver good value. I think they do, but there are a few things that should be said for clarity. My first perspective comes from a range of excellent speakers at 1 or 2 price tiers down from the M7. There's a group of excellent speakers in the $25K to $100K range that help shape the answer. These include the Wilson Sasha V and Watt Puppy, the Tidal Contriva G3, the Magico S series, S2, S3, S5, the Linkwitz LX521.4, and the MBL 101E. I'm sure there are others, but that's a pretty representative group of what seems to be possible in this price range. Each of these speakers is so good that it approaches the threshold where its distortions are low enough that you sometimes forget about the equipment and focus on the music. For music-loving listeners, this threshold can be a key step toward believability, and believability is a key step toward musical engagement. These lower-priced speakers, while expensive, take a significant step in the right direction, and one that simply doesn't seem possible in the next price range down. Though one can always hope. And each of these $25K to $100K speakers has a small but consistently noticeable sonic signature that can act as a reminder that you're not over the threshold. You notice this when you listen to each speaker alone and compare it to the absolute sound. You also notice it when you listen to two of these speaker types in close succession. You immediately notice how different they are on some parameters, and you'll observe with longer listening that one of the speakers seems more right than the other on the parameters that differ. Speakers in the next price level up from 25K to 100K do not always, and maybe not often, progress on the believability front. My observation, or maybe just my assertion, is that quite often the next price level up, let's call it 100K to 250K per pair, gets you slightly wider bandwidth and the ability to work in larger rooms and higher output capability and some refinements on the basic goodness of the speakers in the price band below this. But qualitatively, the higher price speakers are not a step closer to believability. Better, yes, but more believable, no. Remember, that's an assertion, not a survey of all speakers in these two segments. Still, I'm not the only one among experienced listeners who's noticed this. I go into this detail because the Magico M7 does take that significant step up toward believability that those excellent 25K to 100K and higher speakers leave tantalizingly on the table just a short distance out of reach. It's simply hard to identify an element of the M7 sound that distracts when the distraction isn't on the recording. This means there isn't a speaker that, when compared to the M7, is obviously more believable on some parameter or overall. Different maybe, slightly better here or there, but not more believable. The MBL 101X, for example, gets the image off the speakers more reliably, but at the price of some placement precision and air. The title for Bugatti system can seem slightly more controlled, but at the price of a slight diminution of dynamics. My experience is that your believability triggers could be slightly different from mine, so you could easily prefer another of the great speakers. Also, this summary isn't to say that the M7 is perfect, because we know from much past experience that distortions become more obvious as recordings get better and as audio technology advances. And on recordings you favor, it could be that the micro details of the M7 profile don't fit as well as one of the other superb speakers that represent the long development effort of some great designers. Now, you can still ask, and I think you should ask, whether this achievement in crossing the believability threshold is worth it. The part I can't help with is the tightness of your budget and your values or your philosophy. Sorry. Now, I'd also like to talk about some implications for thinking about audio performance regardless of budget. I think that the M7 shows as well as any speaker in recent memory that believability is the important goal for music lovers who listen to audio at home. It's important because it allows a focus on the music and engagement with the music and the thrill of music like nothing else. Adding various colorations to your preferential palette can't do this as often or as effectively. It may be that with a lower budget, where you have to choose between which coloration or colorations you want to live with, that getting the palette to be more pleasing is the right approach. That is possible, in fact, likely, because really it's the only choice, even if believability is very important to you. But we shouldn't confuse that necessity with a core strategy for musical involvement. It will be the rare speaker that has low enough distortion on the many believability factors to get to the other side. However, even below the M7's level of performance, I think the believability model helps to avoid developing your system to what is called a local optimum. You start seeking compensating distortions, and you may find that you've added them in enough places that it seems like you can only keep adding, like Macbeth. The threshold of believability model is a different thing than most of us are accustomed to, and it may be that until you've experienced it, you'll have a hard time understanding it and embracing it and applying it. I think exploring this is worthwhile, though some practice may be necessary. All right, this has been a long review. I think worth it, but it's been long. So let me summarize. I think the M7 is a significant and rare sonic accomplishment. Some advanced speakers are not as resolutely focused on distortion minimization and thus are naturally not as good at crossing the threshold of believability. Magico thus has a philosophical advantage of sorts over some companies, but it still faced the issue of actually delivering technology to lower the coloration needed to get to this level of performance. Impressively, the Magico M7 sets a benchmark across almost all of the important sonic dimensions that we commonly attend to. You will need the right conditions to hear it, and you'll need time to adapt to the lack of coloration. But if you can consider this speaker, I strongly recommend that you try to hear it. If you can't, I hope that it provides food for thought. And I hope you've enjoyed this review of the Magico M7 loudspeaker. Please check in the description for associated equipment, a methodology overview, and example test music. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.